looking around, you've played at some great venues all over the world. And so I was curious, as a musician, both in terms of acoustics and the overall vibe with the audience, do you prefer playing in like the smaller jazz clubs, or do you have a preference to those large concert halls and venues?
It's I wouldn't say I have a preference because they're all great. There's something to
Hmm.
be said for playing in a big jazz festival or a big concert hall and having, a large crowd there and but there's also something to be said for just playing in a real intimate small space. That
Hmm.
can be a lot of fun to play in a small space because you can really feel like you connect not just with the audience but also the musicians. Well, both, because you feed off an energy of the audience as well. And not always, but sometimes when you're playing in a larger venue, it feels like the audience is more distant from you. And often when we're playing on a big stage, we're set up further away from the other musicians too. So it just doesn't quite feel the same. But that's not always true.
Okay, and then you said earlier that you started playing piano at the age of 6, which is very impressive early age. But did you have any influences from the get-go in terms of just any musicians?
Well, I definitely grew up listening to classical music a lot. That's what my parents always played around the house
Hmm.
and took us to see the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra a lot. So I definitely that was some of my earlier influences were classical artists. But once I started getting into jazz, my teachers started recommending all the great pianists to check out. So Chick Corea was always one of my favorites. I mean, there's so many to name, but I always felt like I connected with his music, and I just love him not just as a player but as a composer. In fact, I'm actually right now preparing for a concert playing this piece he wrote called the Lyric Suite, and it's a piece for vibes, piano, and string quartet, and it just kind
Ooh.
of is an example of what an amazing composer he is. But it's going to be a lot of fun playing it with the vibraphonist Warren Wolf. But it was originally written for Gary Burton and himself.
So I'm glad you brought up classical music because I was reading an article that you did with an LA-based jazz website, and you had mentioned how important you thought classical music was and that you listened to it rather frequently. How much of a role does that play, not only in your composing in general, but does it have a lot of carryover when you're composing, say, a jazz piece?
Well, here's what I'll say. I don't like to, or I don't tend to differentiate between genres in terms of like, oh, I'm playing jazz now, so I'm only going to be
Hmm.
influenced by
Yeah.
jazz. And then when I'm listening to classical, that's something else. I just kind of am influenced by all music. So I listen to a lot of different kinds of music. And I don't really think of it as separate things. I think there's amazing harmony and counterpoint and orchestration in classical music, and that definitely affects the way that I play and compose if it's in a jazz context or in any context. So I just kind of think it's all one and the same. It's just good music, you know? Good music is good
Yeah,
music.
yeah, that's awesome. I was looking at your selected discography. You've worked with Paquito de Rivera quite a bit, and you're even involved in a Grammy Award winning album with him. What's it been like working with someone like that who's been in the music world for so long and had such a great deal of success?
I just feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to work with a legend like him. I've been playing in his band now for 16 years. But the way I got started with him, I was a sophomore at the New England Conservatory, and his bassist, Oscar Stagnaro, taught the Latin jazz ensemble there. So I signed up. I was familiar with Oscar, and I really liked playing, for lack of a better term, Latin jazz, and decided to take that ensemble. And Oscar, after a couple weeks, called me to play this gig with himself and the drummer Mark Walker, who's been with Paquito for many years as well. We played a little trio gig at a jazz festival in D.C., but it was just kind of like as part of the festival, just a little gig at a bar. I had this keyboard, and I didn't realize that it was my audition for Paquito's band. So he came to check me out,